Welcome back. So today we're diving into one of the most complex and misunderstood regions on Earth, Kashmir. Behind the stunning landscapes and serene mountains lies a story of conflict, beauty, resilience, and heartbreak. These are the top 10 shocking moments in Kashmir's recent history, events that shook the world, reshaped lives, and continue to echo through generations. Stick around until number 1. It's the moment that changed everything. #10 The 2014 Kashmir floods, one of the deadliest natural disasters in the region's history. Entire neighborhoods submerged, over 500 lives lost, communications cut. But numbers don't tell the full story. Families were stranded on rooftops for days, schools and hospitals were washed away, and the region's economic backbone, its handicraft and tourism industries, were brought to a standstill. Even the Indian Army's rescue efforts were overwhelmed. Locals used social media to coordinate rescues, with makeshift boats navigating the flooded streets of Srinagar. The scale of devastation exposed how fragile the region's infrastructure truly was, and how quickly paradise can turn perilous. To this day, many survivors say the recovery was slower than the flood itself, and that Kashmir was left to rebuild mostly on its own. Number 9. The Amarnath pilgrimage attack. What was meant to be a spiritual journey turned tragic when gunmen ambushed a bus carrying Hindu pilgrims returning from the sacred Amarnath cave. 7 people were killed, including 5 women, and at least 19 others were injured. The bus was not part of the officially secured convoy, making it an easy target. The attack was widely condemned across India and Pakistan, but what followed was even more chilling. Fear began to creep into what had long been a symbol of religious harmony in the region. Security was ramped up, surveillance increased, but so did suspicion. The incident didn't just take lives. It struck at the heart of Kashmir's already fragile communal trust. Even though no group officially claimed responsibility, the attack reignited debates around safety, religious extremism, and the consequences of prolonged conflict. And for many in the valley, it marked the end of an era, when faith could still travel those roads in peace. Number 8. The Burhan Wani protests. On July 8, 2016, 22-year-old militant commander named Burhan Wani was killed in an encounter with Indian security forces. Within hours, the news ignited the valley like wildfire. Burhan wasn't just another militant, he was a social media symbol, charismatic, articulate, and often photographed without a mask. He had built a following among Kashmiri youth who saw him as a voice against oppression. After his death, massive protests erupted across the region. Thousands poured into the streets. Entire towns shut down. The Indian government responded with curfews, internet shutdowns, and most controversially, pellet guns. Over 1,100 people were blinded, or partially blinded, during the clashes. More than 100 civilians died in just a few months. Schools closed for over 100 days. The entire region was paralyzed. International human rights groups condemned the response. But inside India, public opinion was deeply divided. Hero or terrorist? Defender of freedom or threat to peace? Burhan's death didn't end militancy, it transformed it. And for a whole generation in Kashmir, 2016 was the year that changed everything. Number 7. Revocation of Article 370 on August 5, 2019. The Indian government made a move that stunned the world. It revoked Article 370, stripping Jammu and Kashmir of its special autonomous status that had existed since 1949. Overnight, the region was split into 2 federally governed territories. Political leaders were detained, phone lines went dead, the internet was cut off, and tens of thousands of additional troops were deployed to prevent unrest. The valley was under lockdown, not just physically, but digitally and emotionally. Supporters of the move hailed it as a bold step toward national integration and development. But for many in Kashmir, it felt like a betrayal, a constitutional guarantee erased without warning or consent. Protests were suppressed, journalists were barred from reporting freely, and for nearly a year, Kashmiris lived in an information blackout. International reaction was sharp, from the United Nations to Amnesty International. Critics warned of human rights violations and a slide toward authoritarianism. But inside the valley, the bigger question echoed quietly. If identity can be removed with the stroke of a pen, what's left to hold on to? Number 6. The Pulwama Attack. February 14th, 2019. A day that would become a turning point in India-Pakistan relations. A suicide bomber drove a vehicle packed with explosives into a convoy of Indian paramilitary forces in Pulwama, killing 40 CRPF personnel in the deadliest attack on Indian forces in 3 decades. The group, Jaish-e-Mohammed, based in Pakistan, claimed responsibility. Within hours, tensions skyrocketed. Grief turned to outrage. Calls for retaliation echoed across India. 12 days later, the Indian Air Force crossed the line of control and struck what it claimed was a terrorist training camp in Balakot, deep inside Pakistani territory. In response, Pakistan launched its own air raids. One Indian pilot was captured and later returned. For a moment, the world held its breath. 2 nuclear powers were exchanging fire. The threat of war was real. The Pulwama attack not only reshaped India's security doctrine, but also redrew the diplomatic map. It led to increased military presence in the valley, tighter border controls, a surge in nationalist rhetoric across media platforms. But for families in Pulwama, it wasn't about politics or policy. It was about 40 lives gone, and the fear that it could happen again. #5 The 2025 Pahalgam tourist massacre. It was supposed to be the start of Kashmir's tourism revival. Spring had returned to the valley. Hotels in Pahalgam were fully booked. Families were back, cameras in hand, ready to rediscover the heaven on earth. Then, gunfire. In the early hours of March 30th, 2025, a group of armed militants stormed a riverside hotel complex. Within 15 minutes, 26 people were killed, including 17 tourists from Delhi and Mumbai. Several others were critically injured. The attack was swift, brutal, and deliberately aimed at civilians, including women and children. No group officially claimed responsibility, but investigators pointed to foreign-trained infiltrators operating along the line of control. The intent was clear: to destabilize the fragile peace, to crush confidence, to send a message. The massacre sent shockwaves across India and the international community. Flights were canceled, security alerts were issued, and Kashmir's already struggling tourism industry collapsed overnight. But perhaps the most devastating impact was psychological. Locals who had spent years trying to bring visitors back watched their hopes vanish in a hail of bullets. Once again, Kashmir paid the price, not just in lives, but in lost trust. Number 4 Mass exodus of Kashmiri pundits in the winter of 1990. Something irreversible happened in Kashmir. Tens of thousands of Kashmiri pundits, members of the region's Hindu minority, began fleeing their ancestral homes in the valley, overnight, in fear and silence. Targeted killings, threats over loudspeakers, and a growing wave of Islamist militancy forced them to leave behind centuries-old communities, temples, and traditions. What began as isolated violence escalated into a campaign of fear. Prominent figures were assassinated, houses were marked, state machinery seemed powerless or paralyzed. Within a few weeks, over 100,000 pundits had left the valley. Many would never return. Refugee camps were set up in Jammu and Delhi, but conditions were harsh. Families that once owned orchards and libraries now lived in tents with poor sanitation, broken infrastructure, and little hope of return. For decades, the issue became a political flashpoint, debated in headlines but rarely resolved. While the valley moved on, a generation grew up in exile, caught between memories and loss. The exodus wasn't just a demographic shift. Fractured Kashmir's cultural soul, severing bonds between neighbors and rewriting the social fabric of the region forever. Number 3. Cross-border ceasefire violations each year. Hundreds of violations occur across the line of control, the de facto border dividing. India-administered and Pakistan-administered Kashmir. Snipers, mortar fire, sudden shelling of villages. Civilians caught in the middle of military crossfire. These aren't isolated incidents. They're part of a slow-moving war. One that doesn't make international headlines but kills in silence. Between 2016 and 2021, ceasefire violations reached record highs, with some years seeing over 5,000 incidents. Schools near the border were shut. Families lived in underground bunkers. Entire communities became no-go zones after dark. The violence is often tit for tat. One side accuses the other of provocation, and retaliation follows. But the ones who suffer most are NT soldiers. They re the farmers whose fields are laced with unexploded shells. The children who grow up fearing the sound of gunfire. The women forced to flee at a moment's notice. While a 2021 ceasefire agreement brought temporary calm, violations have quietly resumed, especially in sensitive sectors like Poonch, Rajri, and Kupwara. For the people living along the Lok, peace is always fragile, and war is never far away. Number 2. The Kunan Poshpara incident on the night of February 23, 1991. Two remote villages in Kashmir, Kunan and Poshpara, became the site of one of the most haunting and disputed events in the region's history. Residents reported that Indian Army personnel cordoned off the villages under the pretext of a search operation. What allegedly followed was horrific. Dozens of women, from teenage girls to elderly grandmothers, accused soldiers of mass sexual assault during the overnight raid. The incident was immediately denied by the military and quickly dismissed as baseless by early government inquiries. But survivors told a different story, one of trauma, fear, and systemic silence. Medical examinations were delayed. Witnesses were intimidated. Official investigations stalled or were quietly buried. Human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, later called for independent investigations, labeling the episode a possible war crime. But to this day, no soldier has been charged, and no formal justice has been delivered. The women of Kunan and Poshpara became symbols, not just of suffering, but of a fight for dignity in the face of denial. 3 decades later, the incident remains a wound that Kashmir still carries, not just for what happened, but for how it was forgotten. Number 1. The disappeared of Kashmir. Since the early 1990s, more than 8,000 people, mostly young men, have allegedly disappeared in Kashmir. After being taken into custody by security forces, sons, fathers, brothers, they left home for school, for work, for errands, and never came back. Official records often list them as missing, but families insist they were detained. Witnesses recall night raids, blindfolds, and unmarked vehicles. In many cases, no charges were ever filed, and no explanation was given. Organizations like the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons continue to hold monthly sit-ins, carrying faded photographs and signs that ask the same question: where are they? Some believe the missing were buried in the thousands of unmarked graves found across the valley, graves that human rights groups say could be evidence of extrajudicial killings. But the government has largely avoided full investigations, citing national security and insufficient evidence. For the families left behind, time has become its own kind of torment. They live in a limbo between hope and grief. No graves to mourn at, no names on memorials, just a vacuum where life used to be. In Kashmir, the silence of the disappeared still echoes louder than any gunfire, a haunting reminder that in some conflicts, the greatest violence is forgetting.
Kashmir is more than a headline.
Behind every news flash, every number, every policy, there are human lives. Stories of survival, loss, resistance, and resilience. These 10 moments aren't just about politics or borders. They're about people whose lives were changed forever, often without justice, without closure, without the world even noticing. And that's why videos like this matter. If any of these stories moved you, take a second to like the video. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, share it with someone. And if you want to see more truth-driven, story-first content like this, subscribe, because we're just getting started. Let's not let silence write the history of Kashmir. Let's keep the conversation alive.